My name is Liliana Olvera, and my background in advocacy started as a volunteer at a local rape crisis center in Pomona, California. And soon after my volunteer work, I became staff, and I worked in the Hotline SART department. And so my role there was really to support the program coordinator on every piece of our 24-hour hotline, our SART team, anything relating with the advocates. I provided support. And then I became the program coordinator. And really what I wanted to do as a program coordinator was increase the services that we were providing by allowing for other advocates to participate in our training, increase that number, and also strengthen our SART meetings and programs that we had. So I worked really closely with our forensic nurse to ensure that we had participation from every SART member, and also ensure that the survivor's voice was heard throughout our meetings. And after my time at the local level, I started working for California Coalition Against Sexual Assault, CalCASA, and so that's where I am now. I'm one of the project coordinators there, so I've been working a lot with our RCCs and our rape crisis centers and member agencies, providing them with technical assistance on campus sexual assault. We're also working a lot with the Prison Rape Elimination Act, with CDCR facilities, and now we're working with detention centers that house those who are undocumented, so the immigrant population. And so those are kind of my areas that I'm currently working on, but the SART is something really dear and near to my heart because that's where I started. And so we continue our efforts at CalCASA with every group of people. Because the area I was in is covered the east end of LA County, we had 27 cities, and we were a small little office of 9 people in Pomona. And so oftentimes when we responded to cases or to hospital or police, law enforcement agencies, sometimes they didn't know who we were. And so it created sometimes kind of a pushback from law enforcement of who are you, what is your role, what are you doing here, and it required us to provide a lot of education. And so when I started, I thought, gosh, I want to be able to go in there and that our advocates already know, that they know who they are, they know their role, and that they allow for the advocate to come in and provide that support to the survivor. And so for those that don't have a SART, it's critical that they know, because it means everything to allowing the survivor to know that there is someone, an advocate, who can help guide them through, the process, whatever they choose to do. So SARTs are crucial in ensuring that survivors know their rights. And so for me, getting out there, making sure that all parties of the SART team understand everyone's role and know who the advocates are really a key to ensuring that survivors know what their rights are. I think for me, what makes a SART successful is really being in partnership with these folks, right? That we can come together and really talk about how to best provide services to folks that have experienced sexual violence. Survivors should be the center of our discussion always, and ensuring that all survivors have access to this. And the part that I think improves SART is ensuring that all voices from the community are part of that discussion, that it's not just law enforcement, it's not just advocacy groups, that we include those members of the community, because many times survivors are not going to come forward to law enforcement right away. Not often are they going to feel comfortable to come into an advocacy center. They might feel comfortable talking to their teacher, a community organization that they feel really close to, a church. And so first responders are always shifting, right? Who's the first person the survivor feels comfortable with? And so the more we educate those in the community on how to respond to sexual violence, the better an outcome I feel the survivor is going to have when seeking services. And so in including those community voices is what's going to help make SART teams better, I feel. Well, I think it goes back to really talking about survivors, all survivors. How do we ensure that we're reaching out to all identities, there's so many different intersections, there's so many identities that survivors, connect with. So how are we reaching out to every member of the community? And so I think that SARTs have to keep that in mind, right? That when we're really talking about response, when we're talking about ensuring that survivors feel comfortable coming forward, that we have all those different identities in mind, and that we remember that where we're really serving, right? There might be a space where there's more communities of color. So is our services, is our work that we're doing reaching out to those folks? And when they're coming in reporting, are we ensuring that and we're being sensitive to the needs and having holistic approaches, right? That not every survivor is going to be, needing this service or that service, but we really need to understand that a survivor is unique and has their own type of identities and their own special needs. And then I think about those folks that are incarcerated. That work that I've been doing with the Prison Rape Elimination Act. Here they are in this horrible place sometimes for them. Oftentimes they're encountering a lot of sexual violence in there. Males coming forward to say they were assaulted or raped, whether it happened as a child, whether it happened while incarcerated, is very difficult. It's a barrier in itself to be incarcerated and come forward with sexual violence. So these SARTs have to include all members of the community. Members of the community include those prisons and PREA managers or investigators, because we cannot forget about those that are marginalized. We can't move forward with the work that we're doing without hearing the voices of those that most often are not heard. And so once we start including those community members and building those partnerships, we really can start saying that we are looking to eradicating sexual violence. Sexual violence doesn't just occur in the community, it occurs in campuses and in prisons, everywhere, right? So as we're looking towards the future, we have to not forgive those that so often are left behind and so often are forgotten about. The SART response team in prisons are crucial, are so needed, because our incarcerated folks are not heard. We've had the opportunity recently to visit detention centers where immigrant victims are also in there. They come oftentimes to this country because of the violence that is occurring in their home country. Then they come here and encounter sexual violence on the way over. And then they're in these incarcerated settings and oftentimes encounter sexual violence. And then we send them back to their country of origin where they left the violence from. It's a circle of victimization, a circle of violence. It's a pipeline, right? And so when we're looking at this big picture of SART, we have to make sure that all members, that all systems are part of this, so that we don't forget about those that are marginalized, those that are in these settings. They're part of the community as well. Where I see the future of SART really is helping us understand that there are so many members in the community us as advocacy groups, we really talk about the importance of empowerment. And I think that we need to recognize that SARTs are part of a system. And sometimes those systems are they're not re-empowering survivors and can be very disempowering for survivors. So understanding, I think, as a SART that traditionally is very focused on the criminal justice process, that not every survivor is going to want to go that route. And that when we look at the way we form SARTs, that we understand that and include those voices of the communities, so that if the survivor does not feel comfortable going through the criminal justice process, but feels comfortable going through and reaching out to a religious organization, that they're allowed to do that and that they're empowered to make that decision too. That although I think it might be difficult for some SART members to understand, I think that we need to really analyze who is part of SART and who we need to invite into those meetings and those discussions, so that, again, survivors really feel that they have support throughout every step of the way, and that if they choose to stop at any time, that they have that option as well. Building relationships can sometimes be a little difficult, particularly when we're talking about SART, because we all have different focus. And for law enforcement, they're, fact finders. For advocacy groups, they're really there for support services. And so each member has a unique role, but we have to come together. One of the things that has helped our SART program grow in the community was really building those relationships. So it meant that it's not just this quarterly meeting or this monthly meeting. I would reach out to law enforcement, I would reach out to our forensic nurses and say, hey, what can we do to help? What's going on? And it's not just this quarterly meeting that we have, but it becomes more of a relationship. That we got so good at building this relationship within each other that if something happened, we felt really comfortable to call each other and say, hey, this is what happened, we could have done this better, or how can we improve in this? And it wasn't just these at the quarterly meetings, but really it became a working relationship throughout the entire time that we worked at the SART team together. And so building those relationships takes time, and sometimes can be difficult with SART because there's so much turnover. So sometimes we would be working with, a detective on the case, but then they got moved out somewhere else, and so we had a new one. And so ensuring that those relationships were genuine allowed for the new detective to understand, because the outgoing detective took the time to say, hey, this is the number you want to call if this happens, and reach out to this person. And that's what helped our SART, that's what helped us stay connected, because again, there's so much turnover that in order for those relationships to continue, it has to be genuine. Trauma-informed is not just a class that I took and it's a check mark on our list, right? It's really shifting the lens into focusing it's shifting it so that we understand not why are you acting this way, or why are you responding this way, to what happened to you. Looking at that into what happened and how can I help you, right? And so when we're talking about trauma-informed systems, we want to make sure that it's a systemic approach, that it's not just the advocate knowing how to respond to trauma, right? But that every piece of the systems that we're involving our survivors really understand what that means. So when law enforcement is asking questions, we're asking them to be trauma-informed. We're saying, instead of making sure that we're asking open-ended questions, that we're really allowing for the survivor to tell their story, that we're really asking questions that are not victim blaming, that are not questions that help the survivor understand why they're being asked these questions. And so I imagine that if we're all trauma informed, we're not just putting the weight on the victim advocate, but that trauma informed lens is part of every single step the survivor is taking. And so when we start understanding that trauma informed questioning, that trauma informed response, then we start really making changes that everyone in the community knows how to respond to sexual violence in any reports. Well, I think when we're talking about just response in general, as advocacy groups, we want to make sure that folks are trauma informed, that they know how what it means when a survivor might be laughing or might be crying or might not want to speak. It doesn't mean because the survivor's laughing that she's lying or they're lying. It's just their own coping mechanisms, right? So as we become more trauma informed and we inform the community of the different responses to sexual violence, then folks will understand the importance of coming to the table, right? I think that we need to ensure that all voices in the community are part of there. I think of a specific instance when I had a survivor in the room and getting a forensic exam, looking at me and saying, "Are they doing this because they don't believe me?" And it wasn't that. I think that in this particular situation, she was absolutely believed, but there was a language barrier. There was, fear on her end, and she thought she wasn't being believed. And so when I answered that question and said, "No, absolutely, we believe you. Absolutely, they believe you," her demeanor changed. Now, I feel that it takes a lot of education from the community, from SART teams, to our advocates, right? That they need to inform the survivor of their rights, of the reasonings behind a forensic exam, and allowing them to make an educated decision on their own once they have all the information. And so the more we talk about sexual violence, that stigma hopefully will go away at some point, and survivors or victims of sexual violence will feel comfortable coming forward. And knowing that a community is wanting to provide service as well and is there for a survivor can be really empowering. It's crucial that we hear the voice of our survivors. We need to understand what they've just experienced, and we need to understand their experience throughout this SART response from the very beginning. A survivor reaches out to law enforcement and wants to report. Are we allowing the survivor to tell their story? Are we reaching out to the advocate to come provide that support? It's so imperative that the voice of the survivor is heard. Not every survivor is the same. We talked about this in understanding the different identities, the different intersections. And so we have to ensure that all survivor voices are in there in order for us to be helpful, in order for us to be trauma informed, in order for us to be sensitive to the needs of each survivor. We have to ensure that we're talking to our survivors, that when we're doing follow-ups, we ask, how was your experience? How could we better? How can we ensure that throughout the entire reporting, that the survivor really felt comfortable, that the survivor really felt heard? And so we cannot do this work without hearing the voices of our survivors. I think that it's much more than just participating in a SART meeting. I think it's taking the time throughout the entire SART process to ensuring that we're checking in with the survivor. Are you still doing okay? Do you need a break? And that it's not just coming from the advocate, that it comes from the nurse, that it comes from law enforcement, that it is a trauma-informed system response and not just the role of the advocate. So once we start understanding that, once law enforcement, really takes the time to say, I'm here, I want to hear your story, take your time, and knows how to interview with a trauma-informed lens, that's how we hear the survivor. It's not just following up and saying, I'd like to check in with you about this, and that. It's throughout the entire process, right? That we ensure that all members of SART really hear the survivor and are checking in with the survivor. I can think of two specific situations where we had a survivor who was not ready to report to law enforcement. She wanted a forensic exam but didn't want to report yet. So we honored that. As a SART member and team, we said, okay, we're going to help you get the SART exam without law enforcement involvement. When we did that, she was really, really happy that she was going to be able to preserve this evidence, and that when she was ready, she would come forward and report what had occurred. We did that. We honored that. She received an exam, and law enforcement needed to come over and pick up the kit. We informed the survivor that law enforcement would be here. They wouldn't ask any questions, but they were coming just to pick up, but that she could, if she wanted to, talk to the law enforcement agent. And she said, yes, I'd like to talk to them. I'd like to ask some questions without identifying myself. Which law enforcement was really gracious and said, absolutely. The first thing the law enforcement agent said was, I know that this is going to be really difficult for you, and that my presence coming in with my uniform and everything on me might be intimidating. But I want you to know that I'm here to listen, and whatever you decide, I will support. Those comments made all the difference for the survivor. And the survivor started asking questions. What happens if I do this? What happens if I move forward? And the officer took his time and explained and even said, there's going to be some questions that you might think are really invasive, but I have to ask them. And I can give you time to answer, and I can try to rephrase the questions, but know that I have to know some certain things. And she said, okay, can you give me an example of one question? And he asked it, and she was able to answer. And that time that he took, it was 3-5 minutes at the most, changed the survivor's way of, and thought about reporting, and reported at that minute and said, okay, I feel comfortable doing this. It took the officer 3 to 5 minutes to do that and accomplish that rapport, right? And so those moments, those officers that take that time to do that, is what makes all the difference for a survivor. In this case, the survivor moved forward. She felt comfortable to report. Throughout the process, she started finding out, different things that had occurred in the past, and they moved forward. And the case was picked up and eventually was taken to trial. Had the officer come in a different way, in a different demeanor, that wouldn't have probably happened because she was so scared. But because he took the time, it made all the difference. And so that was him hearing her and believing her. And so that case to me has always stood out as a successful response to SART. Not because she reported, but because she felt believed and she felt that she could move forward with whatever direction she took. The survivor feedback is needed in order to better these systems because we're serving survivors. And so anytime I received any feedback, whether it was related to the nurse, whether it was related to law enforcement or the DA or whatever process that they were choosing, I always gave that feedback. And if there was time that our advocates weren't the best, I received that feedback too. And so we just need to remember that we're there for the survivor. If the survivor wasn't reporting, then the SART team isn't responding, right? So we have to hear our clients, we have to hear our patients, we have to hear our victim, we have to hear our survivor. And so in order for that to happen, we need to be okay with bettering our systems and being more trauma informed. When I think about a survivor, we're asking a survivor to share an experience that will change that survivor's life forever. We hope that it won't define who they are, but that we understand how traumatic that experience is. And specifically when we're talking about communities of color, there can be already some hesitation to come forward because of X, Y, and Z, or because their experience with law enforcement might have not been the best, right? So we as service providers, as law enforcement agents, whatever, district attorneys, every member of SART that has been in part of SART traditionally, we can't take it personally. We have to remember that it's the survivor's experience. And if the survivor has felt in any way not heard or mistreated, we have to honor that and recognize that maybe our response or our questionings or whatever piece of that happened is something we can improve on. We're not perfect, and we need to recognize that and allow to improve. There's always ways, there's always moments where we might not feel as comfortable. We might be having a bad day. And so sometimes we might ask a question that seems very victim blaming. And so we have to, again, listen to the survivor and respect the survivor's feelings and own experience. And so what I tell our SART members is take it and improve. Take it and provide, allow for feedback. And that's what SART is, right? We hope that when we're meeting together that we talk about some challenges we've encountered, some feedback from survivors who feel comfortable telling the advocates at times and not law enforcement. And that often happens where the survivor really feels they can talk to the advocate and say, I really felt this way when he or she was asking me this. Or I felt that they were blaming me because of what happened, because I was out at night or because I was at a party or whatever the reason is. So SART members need to allow for that feedback. So the Prison Rape Elimination Act, PREA, applies to all incarcerated settings. The work that we've been doing has been with CDCR, which is the California Department of Corrections and Rehabilitation. And so we've been working with these facilities and ensuring their compliance with these PREA standards. And the PREA standards really connect with the rape crisis centers as they are victim advocates. And so these standards ensure that incarcerated survivors have access to the same support that they would in the community, which means they have the right to have a forensic exam, a victim advocate throughout the investigatory process. They have the right to report sexual violence and receive any in-person counseling, hotline, letter writing, and the same support that we offer survivors in the community is ensuring that those that are incarcerated also have them. And so the process has been really a learning experience for so many of us. It's really focused on culture change, and it's been a process to understand corrections, and also for corrections to understand the role of the rape crisis centers. We started really by working with these facilities so that they knew of the services that were available, and also has led to the development of MOUs, so Memorandums of Understandings, with CDCR headquarters and the designated Rape Crisis Center. We've also been able to provide training for corrections on how to respond to sexual violence. A lot of times, folks that are correction officers don't understand the dynamics of power and control and sexual assault and intimate partner violence as well. So understanding that cycle of violence has been really enlightening for corrections, and also understand why folks don't come forward. We've also really tried to understand the culture within the facility with incarcerated folks. The power and control there is really evident. And so for someone in a male prison to come forward and say, I've been a victim of sexual assault, can be very difficult. We have met with inmates who are part of the Inmate Advisory Council who have said, there is no way that anybody is going to come forward. There is no way that anybody's going to say, I've been a victim of rape, whether it happened to me as a child, whether it happened to me incarcerated. But then we have created these relationships with these CDCR folks and put up posters and put up flyers and put up phone numbers, and we're starting receiving calls and we're receiving letters. For someone who is incarcerated to say, I've been sexually assaulted or I've been raped, to come forward, and although all of the stigma will come, the disempowerment might come because my cellmate might know why I'm coming forward. My cellmate might be my perpetrator. It takes a lot. And it shows the crisis that they're in, right? That they're willing to go through all of this to seek services. They're desperate. They want that service. And so the work that we've been doing has created this avenue for folks that are in these settings to really feel that they can come forward. We've worked with folks that are in juvenile detention centers as well. How, and the way that we've approached that is, how do we ensure that the survivors get those services that they need? Because again, they're part of the community. At some point, they might come out of those facilities and be a member of our community. So how do we ensure that they have access to this support within this setting, and also once they leave, that they know where to go? And so that work that CalCASA has been doing has been life-changing for our incarcerated folks. They have shared that they have never felt heard, that they never have dealt with these issues of sexual violence that had occurred to them, which led to drug abuse, which led to alcohol abuse, which then led to them being incarcerated. And so the sexual assault to prison pipeline is real. And again, when we're looking at those settings, who are in there? Predominantly marginalized communities. those that are more marginalized are who we find in these facilities who are victims of sexual violence, of domestic abuse, and we hear their stories and we see their pain. And so when I think about the Prison Rape Elimination Act, we have to, in every piece, right, anywhere we're at, look at these folks, humanize them, because they're treated as a number, right? We need to humanize them, humanize their experience, and reach out to our facilities that are in our communities to ensure that these folks have access to support. Now we're looking at detention facilities. Like I mentioned earlier, they're also under the PREA standards, and they have those same rights that any victim of sexual violence has. Going into those detention centers have been a very different experience than going into CDCR facilities. These people are encountering sexual violence, coming to here, being here, and then we're sending them back to a country where they left most likely because of violence as well. They are definitely one of the less heard folks in there. And then we also need to recognize that those folks that are in those detention centers are from all over the world. I've met with folks that are from Haiti, that are from Africa, that are from Mexico, that are from South America. They're all from all over. There's language barriers, there's cultural barriers. There's so many things that keep them from coming forward and saying, I experienced this. How can service providers, how can advocacy groups come in and provide this service when there's so much going on, right? So we have to make sure that we are centering the margins, that the work that we are doing really reaches out to folks that very rarely have these services available to them, that very rarely are seen. And so our hope for these projects is really to look at the gap of services and ensure that those services are available to survivors. We're looking at creating a culture shift within corrections so that they understand that these perceived relationships that they're having is for survival. And that the place that they're in is very much focused on power and control, that they need to do whatever they can to survive. And so that means that sometimes folks will have to do certain things to others in order for survival. And that doesn't mean consent, right? That means they're doing it because they need to survive in there. What drives me to do this work is really for folks that so often are not believed, so often are not heard. And I think of my very first accompaniment, and I think of that 3-year-old little girl who was assaulted by her grandfather. And I remember her face. I remember her looking at me and saying to her mother and I, it's gonna be okay. I'll be okay. That strength that this 3-year-old had changed me forever. The way up there, I was so nervous. And how was it that I was going to provide this support to a little 3-year-old? But yet, when I got there, she was so strong, and her mom was so devastated. But she reminded her mom and I that things were going to be okay. And so what I often tell survivors is, we're going to get through it together. we're going to make sure that you get the help that you need. And I have that 3-year-old little girl in mind, that although it was her grandfather, that she was strong and that she's still doing good with the help of advocacy groups, with the help of her family and the help of support systems. And so we cannot forget about our survivors. We cannot say that we want to eradicate sexual violence and not look at every member of the community. We have to have holistic approaches. We have to make sure that we reach out to all community members. And so my hope is that one day we'll be serving coffee instead of trying to eradicate sexual violence because it's been eradicated already. I really envision a world free from sexual violence. And so that 3-year-old girl is what moves me to continue this work, that there is healing and there is hope, and we're going to be able to help them through that process.